The morning started with a flat tire, an annoyance that made him 30 minutes late for his first meeting. "Just what I need," Marcus mumbled, wrestling with the spare tire in the cramped garage of his apartment complex. The lug nuts seemed determined to remain welded to the wheel, and his dress shirt was already collecting grease stains despite his careful attempts to stay clean. The spare tire, when he finally managed to mount it, looked pitifully small compared to the regular tires, giving his sedan an oddly lopsided appearance that made him wince every time he caught sight of it in his peripheral vision. The jack had been temperamental from the start, requiring multiple attempts to get it positioned correctly under the car's frame. Marcus had watched a dozen YouTube videos on changing tires over the years, but none of them had prepared him for the reality of wrestling with rusted bolts in a poorly lit garage while dressed for a business meeting. His hands were now thoroughly blackened with grease and grime, and he'd managed to tear a small hole in his pants knee while crouching beside the car. The spare tire itself looked like it belonged on a completely different vehicle, one of those miniature emergency donuts that seemed designed more for getting you to a tire shop than for actual driving. As Marcus lowered the car and gathered his tools, he couldn't help but notice how the whole vehicle now tilted slightly to one side, like a wounded animal trying to maintain its dignity. The visual was almost comical, if it weren't happening to him on what was already shaping up to be an important day at work. Traffic, as if sensing his already frayed nerves, conspired against him with unusual creativity. A fender bender on the highway created a bottleneck that stretched for miles, leaving him trapped behind a pickup truck belching diesel fumes while he watched the minutes tick by on his dashboard clock. The truck's driver seemed oblivious to the black smoke pouring from his exhaust pipe, or perhaps he simply didn't care about the environmental impact of his vehicle's obvious mechanical problems. Marcus tried calling ahead to reschedule his meeting, but his phone chose that exact moment to display the dreaded "no service" message, leaving him to imagine his client's growing irritation with each passing minute. He held his phone up to the windshield, waved it around the car's interior, and even tried holding it out the window, but the signal bars remained stubbornly absent. The irony wasn't lost on him. In an age where everyone was supposedly connected all the time, he was completely cut off when he needed communication most. The radio wasn't much help either, cycling through traffic reports that seemed to cover every highway except the one he was currently stuck on. The morning DJ's cheerful banter about weekend plans and upcoming concerts felt like mockery as Marcus sat motionless in a sea of brake lights, watching his carefully planned schedule disintegrate minute by minute. When he finally arrived at the office building, sweaty and disheveled, the elevator was out of order. A hastily printed sign taped to the elevator doors apologized for the inconvenience and promised repairs as soon as possible, which in building management speak could mean anything from later that afternoon to sometime next month. 8 flights of stairs in a wool suit jacket felt like climbing Mount Everest in August, and Marcus could feel his carefully applied deodorant failing him with each step. By the time he reached his floor, his carefully styled hair had transformed into a damp, unruly mess, and his shirt clung to his back like a second skin. His breathing was labored and his face was flushed with exertion, making him look less like a competent business professional and more like someone who'd just run a marathon in formal wear. The receptionist gave him a sympathetic smile as he rushed past, but he caught her stifling a laugh at his appearance, which only added to his mounting embarrassment. His client, Mr. Henderson, was surprisingly understanding about the delay, though Marcus noticed him glancing at his watch more frequently than usual throughout their meeting. Henderson was an older gentleman who prided himself on punctuality and preparation, traits that Marcus usually shared and appreciated. The fact that Marcus had arrived looking like he'd been wrestling with machinery, which, technically, he had, clearly made an impression, though Henderson was too polite to comment directly on his disheveled appearance. The presentation went reasonably well despite Marcus's scattered mental state, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was operating at half capacity, his usual sharp focus clouded by the morning's frustrations. He found himself stumbling over words he'd rehearsed dozens of times, and his hands trembled slightly as he advanced through his PowerPoint slides. Henderson asked good questions and seemed engaged with the content, but Marcus could sense an underlying tension in the room that hadn't been there in their previous meetings. Later, at the office, his usually reliable Wi-Fi decided to play hide-and-seek, turning a simple report into an hour-long ordeal. The internet connection flickered in and out like a dying light bulb, loading pages with the speed of molasses in winter. Marcus watched progress bars crawl across his screen at glacial pace, each percentage point representing another minute of his day lost to technological incompetence. Every few minutes, just as he'd managed to input a paragraph of data, the connection would drop, erasing his progress and forcing him to start over. The system didn't seem to have any kind of autosave function, which meant that each dropped connection was like watching his work disappear into a digital black hole. Marcus found himself saving obsessively after every sentence, but even that wasn't enough to prevent the periodic loss of progress. The IT department, when he finally managed to reach them, informed him with maddening cheerfulness that they were aware of the issue and were working on it, but couldn't provide any timeline for resolution. The support technician spoke with a kind of practiced calm that suggested this was far from the first call they'd received about the problem, but their inability to offer any concrete solutions was frustrating beyond measure. Marcus found himself staring at his computer screen with growing frustration, watching the spinning wheel of doom mock his attempts to be productive. The report, which should have taken 20 minutes to complete, stretched into an endless cycle of typing, losing connection, retyping, and losing connection again. He tried switching to his phone's hotspot, but the office's thick walls seemed to block cellular signals with the efficiency of a Faraday cage. The building was one of those older structures that had been retrofitted for modern technology, without much consideration for how well those technologies would actually work within its confines. The walls were thick concrete and steel, designed for durability rather than wireless signal transmission. Marcus had always appreciated the building's solid construction and classic architecture, but today those same features felt like obstacles designed specifically to frustrate him. His colleague, Mark, who was usually a boisterous presence filling the office with his loud phone conversations and spontaneous outbursts of laughter, seemed unusually subdued. Instead of his typical morning routine of regaling anyone within earshot with stories from his weekend adventures or commentary on the latest sports scores, Mark sat hunched over his desk, offering only cryptic grunts when Marcus tried to lighten the mood with jokes about their shared technological misery. Mark was the kind of person who could find humor in almost any situation, the office comedian who could turn even the most mundane workplace problems into entertaining anecdotes. His desk was decorated with funny cartoons and motivational posters with humorous twists, and he was always the first to organize after-work happy hours or impromptu lunch gatherings. This subdued, almost secretive version of Mark was so out of character that it was almost unsettling. "Rough morning?" Marcus had asked, settling into the chair beside Mark's desk with his third cup of coffee, hoping for some commiseration and maybe a few laughs to help salvage his deteriorating day. Mark looked up briefly, his usually animated face wearing an expression Marcus couldn't quite decipher. There was something almost guilty in his eyes, mixed with what might have been anxiety or excitement. "Yeah, something like that," he mumbled, then immediately returned his attention to his computer screen with an intensity that seemed forced. His fingers drummed nervously on his desk, a habit Marcus had never noticed before in all their years of working together. "The Wi-Fi's been acting up all morning," Marcus continued, trying to draw out his normally chatty colleague. "I swear this place is held together with duct tape and prayers. Henderson probably thinks I'm completely incompetent after showing up looking like I'd been mud wrestling." Mark responded without looking up, his tone flat and distracted. The conversation died there, leaving Marcus feeling oddly unsettled. Mark's behavior was so out of character that Marcus found himself wondering if something serious was wrong. Maybe Mark was dealing with personal issues, or perhaps he was feeling under the weather. Whatever it was, the office felt strangely quiet, without Mark's usual energy filling the space. The strangeness continued when Marcus tried to coordinate lunch plans with a few other coworkers. Everyone seemed to have sudden, urgent commitments that prevented them from joining him. Sarah from accounting claimed she had a doctor's appointment she'd forgotten about, which was unusual since Sarah was typically meticulous about her schedule and never forgot appointments. Tom from marketing said he had to stay in to catch up on deadlines, despite having mentioned just the day before that he was ahead of schedule on all his projects. Even Janet from HR, who never turned down a free meal and was always eager to escape the office for any reason, begged off with some excuse about a family obligation. Janet was notorious for her appetite and her ability to find the best lunch deals in the area. She maintained a mental catalog of every restaurant within a 10-block radius and their daily specials, and she treated lunch breaks like sacred time that shouldn't be interrupted by work concerns. By noon, Marcus found himself eating a sad sandwich alone at his desk, surrounded by colleagues who kept glancing at him when they thought he wasn't looking. The paranoid part of his brain began to whisper that maybe he'd done something wrong. Maybe he'd offended someone without realizing it. He mentally reviewed his recent interactions, searching for any moment where he might have said something inappropriate or insensitive, but came up empty. The sandwich itself was a sorry affair: stale bread, wilted lettuce, and what appeared to be processed turkey that had seen better days. Marcus had purchased it from the building's basement cafeteria, a grim little establishment that seemed to specialize in food that had been sitting under heat lamps for questionable amounts of time. The fact that he was eating this culinary disappointment alone only added to his sense that the day was spiraling completely out of control. The afternoon brought its own series of small disasters. The coffee machine in the break room broke down just as Marcus was desperately in need of a caffeine fix, leaving him to contemplate the vending machine's questionable energy drinks. The machine had apparently been temperamental for weeks, according to a handwritten note taped to its front, but today it had finally given up entirely. Water pooled around its base, and the digital display flickered weakly before going completely dark. The vending machine's energy drinks looked like they belonged in a chemistry lab rather than a human stomach. Neon colors that didn't occur in nature, and ingredient lists that read like toxic waste disposal instructions. Marcus studied his options with growing despair, eventually settling on what appeared to be the least artificial-looking option, though least artificial was definitely a relative term in this context. The copier jammed when he tried to print important documents for an upcoming presentation, and the repair technician wouldn't be available until the following week. The machine had eaten his original document and was now making ominous grinding noises while displaying an error code that wasn't listed in the troubleshooting guide. Marcus spent 20 minutes trying various combinations of button presses and paper tray manipulations, but the copier seemed determined to remain broken out of pure spite. His computer mouse decided to develop a mind of its own, the cursor jumping around the screen erratically, making precise work nearly impossible. The mouse would work normally for a few minutes, lulling Marcus into a false sense of productivity, then suddenly start behaving like it was possessed by a particularly vindictive spirit. Clicking on one icon would somehow activate something completely different, and trying to select text became an exercise in futility. Even the weather seemed to turn against him. What had started as a partly cloudy morning had transformed into a steadily darkening sky that threatened rain. Through his office window, Marcus watched people on the street below hurrying along with umbrellas and raincoats, while he sat there realizing he'd left his umbrella at home on his kitchen counter, right where he'd see it and remember to grab it on his way out. The irony of perfect placement for memory, but complete failure in execution seemed to sum up his entire day. The sky had taken on that particular shade of gray that promised not just rain, but the kind of sustained, soaking precipitation that would leave anyone caught in it thoroughly miserable. Marcus could see people checking their phones for weather updates and quickening their pace as they sensed the approaching storm. The atmospheric pressure seemed to be dropping, giving him the beginnings of a headache that compounded his already fragile mental state. As the day wore on, Marcus's mood continued to deteriorate. Every small inconvenience felt magnified, each minor setback building on the last until he felt like he was drowning in a sea of petty annoyances. He tried to maintain his usual optimistic outlook, reminding himself that everyone had bad days and that tomorrow would surely be better, but the constant stream of minor disasters was wearing him down in ways he hadn't expected. The cumulative effect was particularly frustrating because none of the individual problems were catastrophic. A flat tire was fixable, Wi-Fi problems were temporary, and office equipment failures were part of modern life. But the relentless sequence of small failures felt like some kind of cosmic practical joke, as if the universe had decided to test his patience and resilience with a carefully orchestrated series of minor tortures. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly aware of every small thing that went wrong, hypervigilant for the next minor disaster. When his pen ran out of ink in the middle of taking notes, he felt a disproportionate surge of anger. When the water cooler dispensed lukewarm water instead of the cold refreshment he desperately needed, it felt like a personal betrayal. Each small problem that would normally barely register on his consciousness now felt like another weight added to an already overwhelming load. The final straw came when he decided to call Chloe, Sarah's best friend and their go-to person for planning anything social. Marcus and Sarah had been dating for almost 2 years, and Chloe had become something of a fixture in their social circle. She was the type of person who always knew the best restaurants, could get reservations at impossible-to-book venues, and somehow managed to organize group activities that actually worked out for everyone involved. Chloe had an almost supernatural ability to coordinate complex social events, keeping track of everyone's schedules, dietary restrictions, and personal preferences with the efficiency of a professional event planner. She maintained detailed mental files on every restaurant in the city, knew which venues had the best happy hour deals, and could somehow convince overbooked establishments to squeeze in one more table for her group. Her friends had learned to defer to her judgment on all matters social, and her recommendations were treated with the respect typically reserved for expert opinions. Marcus had been looking forward to dinner plans they'd tentatively discussed the week before. Sarah had been working long hours on a big project, and he thought a nice evening out might be exactly what they both needed to reconnect and unwind. He'd been planning to suggest that new Italian place downtown that had been getting rave reviews, maybe follow it up with a walk through the park if the weather cleared up. The Italian restaurant had been written up in several local publications, praised for its authentic cuisine and intimate atmosphere. Marcus had been reading reviews online during his lunch break, salivating over descriptions of handmade pasta and wood-fired pizzas. The thought of a leisurely dinner with Sarah, away from the stresses of work and surrounded by good food and warm lighting, had been one of the few bright spots in his increasingly dark day. But when he called Chloe, her usual warm, enthusiastic voice was replaced by something strained and uncomfortable. She seemed distracted, answering his questions with uncharacteristic brevity. Chloe was typically the kind of person who could turn a simple phone call about dinner plans into a 20-minute conversation covering everything from restaurant reviews to her latest dating adventures to her opinions on current events. "Hey, Chloe, just wanted to confirm about dinner tonight," Marcus said, settling back in his office chair and trying to inject some cheerfulness into his voice despite the day's frustrations. "Oh, about that," Chloe stammered, and Marcus could practically hear her fidgeting on the other end of the line. Her voice had a quality he'd never heard before, nervous, almost panicked. "I'm really sorry, but I can't make it tonight. There's been a family emergency." "Oh no, is everything okay?" Marcus asked, immediately concerned. Despite his own problems, he genuinely cared about Chloe and her family. "Is there anything I can do to help? Do you need me to drive you somewhere or help with anything?" No, it's fine," Chloe said quickly, almost too quickly. Her response came so fast it almost sounded rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing this explanation. "It's just you know how family stuff can be. Really last minute. I'm really sorry about the short notice." Something in her tone didn't sit right with Marcus. Chloe was usually an open book, ready to share details about everything from her latest dating disasters to her ongoing feuds with her upstairs neighbor. She was the kind of person who provided context and background for everything, often to the point of oversharing. This evasive, almost guilty-sounding Chloe was completely out of character and frankly a little concerning. "Well, what about Sarah?" Marcus pressed, trying to get some clarity on the situation. "Should I call her directly, or do you think we should just postpone until next week? I know she's been really stressed with that big project at work." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, so long that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. He pulled his phone away from his ear to check the connection, but the call timer was still running. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled only by what sounded like muffled voices in the background on Chloe's end. "Chloe? You still there?" "Yeah, I'm here," she said finally, her voice sounding even more strained than before. Maybe you should talk to Sarah directly. About tonight, I mean. She can probably explain things better than I can. The conversation ended with more awkward pleasantries and promises to reschedule soon, but Marcus hung up feeling more confused than ever. Chloe's behavior had been strange enough, but her suggestion that he talk to Sarah directly about their dinner plan struck him as odd. Of course he'd talk to Sarah directly. She was his girlfriend. Why would Chloe phrase it like that, as if there was something he needed to discuss with Sarah beyond simple logistics? The more Marcus thought about the conversation, the more puzzling it became. Chloe had sounded nervous, almost guilty, as if she were hiding something. But what could she possibly need to hide about dinner plans? And why had she been so vague about the family emergency? Normally, Chloe would have provided a detailed explanation of exactly what was wrong and who was involved, probably along with a request for advice or support. Marcus chalked it up to a chaotic week, a series of unfortunate but unrelated events that were simply testing his patience and resilience. Everyone had weeks like this, he told himself. Sometimes the universe just seemed determined to throw every possible inconvenience your way, like some cosmic test of your ability to handle stress and maintain your sanity in the face of endless minor disasters. He tried to focus on the positive aspects of his situation. His client meeting, despite the rocky start, had gone well enough. Henderson hadn't canceled their contract or stormed out of the room, which had to count as a victory given Marcus's appearance and tardiness. The Wi-Fi had eventually stabilized enough for him to finish his report, even if it had taken 3 times longer than it should have. His flat tire had been a hassle, but at least it had happened in his apartment complex rather than on some remote highway in the middle of nowhere. These were all problems with solutions, temporary setbacks rather than genuine crises. Marcus had dealt with worse situations in his life, and he'd survived them all. There was no reason to think this day was anything more than a particularly concentrated dose of bad luck, the kind of day that would make for funny stories once enough time had passed to dull the frustration. But as the afternoon wore on, Marcus found it increasingly difficult to maintain his optimistic perspective. The accumulation of small problems felt like death by 1,000 cuts, each individual issue minor and manageable on its own, but collectively exhausting in a way that left him feeling drained and irritable. His usually robust patience was wearing thin, and he found himself snapping at minor annoyances that wouldn't normally bother him at all. He barely noticed the knowing glances exchanged between Mark and Chloe when she stopped by the office around 4 o'clock, supposedly to drop off some documents for a mutual friend who worked on their floor. Marcus was too absorbed in his own frustrations to pay attention to the way Mark's eyes lit up when he saw Chloe, or how they huddled together in quiet conversation by the water cooler, their voices too low for him to overhear. If he had been paying attention, he might have noticed how Mark kept glancing in his direction during their whispered exchange, or how Chloe seemed to be asking urgent questions that made Mark nod seriously. He might have caught the way they both looked relieved when their conversation ended, like people who had just coordinated something important and delicate, or how they kept checking their phones as if waiting for important updates. But Marcus was too busy wrestling with a printer that had decided to produce streaky, barely legible copies of his presentation materials to notice any of this. The printer seemed to be running low on toner, but the replacement cartridge was locked in a supply closet that required special authorization to access. By the time he looked up from his technological troubles, Chloe was already heading toward the elevator, and Mark was back at his desk, once again hunched over his computer with that same forced intensity he'd been displaying all day. The final hours of the workday crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus's productivity had ground to a near halt, his focus scattered by the day's accumulated frustrations and his growing sense that something wasn't quite right in his small corner of the world. He kept catching people in whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when they noticed him nearby. Colleagues who usually greeted him with friendly waves seemed to avoid eye contact. Even the normally chatty security guard at the front desk had given him nothing more than a curt nod when he'd passed by earlier, which was completely out of character. Bill, the security guard, was usually good for at least a 5-minute conversation about sports or weather or weekend plans. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's names and asked about their families, treating the lobby like his personal social club. His sudden taciturnity was just another piece of the increasingly strange puzzle that Marcus's day had become. By 6 o'clock, Marcus was more than ready to call it a day. He packed up his belongings with perhaps more force than necessary, shoving papers into his briefcase and slamming his laptop shut with a satisfying snap. The sound echoed through the now quiet office, and he noticed several colleagues looking in his direction with expressions he couldn't quite read. There was something almost expectant in their faces, as if they were waiting for something to happen. As he prepared to leave, he caught Mark watching him with an expression that might have been sympathy, or guilt, or something else entirely. Mark's usual animated features were unusually serious, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he wanted to say something but couldn't quite figure out how. "See you tomorrow, Mark," Marcus said, trying to inject some normalcy into his voice despite feeling increasingly paranoid about everyone's strange behavior. "Yeah," Mark replied, then seemed to struggle with something before adding, "Hey, Marcus? I hope everything works out okay." The comment struck Marcus as strange. Everything works out with what? His report was finished. His client meeting had gone reasonably well despite the chaotic start, and while his day had been frustrating, nothing had happened that required particular resolution. Mark's words carried in weight that seemed disproportionate to the situation, as if he were referring to something much more significant than Marcus's minor workplace inconveniences. But Marcus was too eager to escape the office and end this cursed day to pursue the question. He simply nodded and headed for the stairwell, since the elevator was still out of order. The thought of climbing down 8 flights of stairs wasn't appealing, but at this point it felt like just another minor annoyance in a day full of them. As he stormed out of the office building and into the early evening air, Marcus found himself muttering about his cursed luck. The threatened rain had held off, but the sky remained overcast and gloomy, matching his mood perfectly. His ridiculous spare tire made his car look like a wounded animal limping through the parking lot, and he winced as he climbed behind the wheel. The parking lot was nearly empty, most of his colleagues having left already for their evening activities. The few remaining cars sat scattered across the asphalt like abandoned chess pieces, and Marcus couldn't help but notice how isolated his own vehicle looked with its pathetic temporary tire. The image seemed to perfectly capture how he felt, alone, damaged, and struggling to maintain forward momentum. The drive home was blissfully uneventful, perhaps the first thing to go right all day. Traffic moved smoothly, his phone maintained its connection, and the spare tire held up without any dramatic failures. Marcus found himself almost afraid to trust this sudden streak of normalcy, as if acknowledging it might somehow jinx the situation and bring about some new disaster. But instead of feeling relieved, Marcus found himself almost suspicious of this sudden streak of normalcy, as if the universe were simply lulling him into a false sense of security before delivering the next disaster. He'd been so conditioned by the day's constant stream of problems that the absence of new issues felt almost ominous, like the calm before a storm. As he pulled into his apartment complex and saw Sarah's car already parked in its usual spot, Marcus felt a genuine smile cross his face for the first time all day. Sarah's reliable blue Honda sat exactly where it always did, and the familiar sight provided the first real comfort he'd felt since discovering his flat tire that morning. Whatever weirdness had infected his work environment, whatever strange mood had possessed Mark and Chloe, at least he could count on Sarah to provide some sanity and comfort at the end of this thoroughly bizarre day. He had no way of knowing that upstairs in his apartment, Sarah was putting the finishing touches on the most elaborate surprise party their friends had ever attempted to coordinate, or that Mark's strange behavior had been the result of trying to keep an enormous secret while watching Marcus grow increasingly frustrated and paranoid throughout the day. He couldn't have imagined that Chloe's evasiveness had been born of pure panic at nearly ruining weeks of careful planning with a single careless phone call. The apartment complex was quiet in the early evening, with most residents either still at work or settled in for the night. Marcus climbed the stairs to his second-floor unit, his key ready and his mind already focused on the prospect of a quiet evening with Sarah. Maybe they could order pizza and watch a movie, something simple and relaxing that would help wash away the day's accumulated stress. As Marcus climbed the stairs to his apartment, His key ready and his mind already focused on the prospect of a quiet evening with Sarah, he remained blissfully unaware that his day of minor mishaps was about to transform into something entirely unexpected. The universe, it seemed, had been saving the biggest surprise for last.